Okay, I think we are ready to make a start. So once again, good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe. My name is Giacomo Persi Paoli. I am the head of UNIDIR's Security and Technology program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch event of our latest work in the cyber domain, our taxonomy of malicious ICT incidents that I have had the pleasure of co-author with my colleague, Dr. Samuele Dominioni, that is joining us from Geneva. This is a very interesting, it was a very interesting project for us because sometimes we produce these big reports that are very interesting, very detailed, but normally end up sitting on a shelf. We wanted to do something a little bit different this time. We wanted really to produce a usable tool that all of you, member states and other stakeholders can use as a reference tool, if you want, as a baseline knowledge or baseline terminology that can be helpful in a variety of ways, can be helpful to support the negotiations or the discussions within the OEWG, can be helpful in supporting information sharing on threats among member states, particularly for those member states that don't already have a fully developed kind of national threat assessment capability. But it's also useful for national practices themselves, again, for those states that have an interest in having an easy-to-consult tool to map their own threat landscape and be able to intervene where needed. So first and foremost, I would like to thank Ambassador Jaarsma here on my left from the Netherlands to accept to be our speaker today to deliver some opening remarks. And I'd like, of course, to thank all of SecTech donors, particularly those supporting our cyber work, so the government of France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and Microsoft. With that, please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
And good morning, everyone. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, but I should really say good morning, friends, and old friends, new friends, to-be friends. And it is always a pleasure to be sitting next to Giacomo. We are, as the Netherlands, pleased to support this side event on the work that UNIDIR has done on this taxonomy for characterizing malicious incidents. And indeed, of course, I read the report, and I think we need this, but not on A4, but then what is it, A2 poster format, and hang it up in the office. I think it is a very useful tool in providing all members of the open-ended working group with some extensive knowledge on a scheme of classification in order to help characterizing malicious ICT activities. And it is true that sometimes we have the impression that we're talking about the same issues, but actually we do not have the same understanding of what certain words mean or imply. So we welcome the work done by the research community at large on taxonomies, and UNIDIR being independent and working with experts from all regions is in a very good position for building greater understanding through this taxonomy. For an audience like myself, a diplomat, policymaker, who are working on responsible state behavior on ICT in the context of peace and security. And as indicated in the report, some of the terms that are related to cyber attacks are sometimes too technical for the audience like myself. There are obviously exceptions. But this document will help us ensuring a better understanding of terms and classification. It will help us hopefully in the open-ended working group, but also more broadly in discussions, well, addressing the issue of malicious ICT activities. I believe the report provides a very insightful view on some terms that we are using to identify different elements And as we dive into more detailed discussions, this will for sure be a very useful tool. In addition, I believe that in the context of the future program of action, that should be action-oriented, this would also be very useful to help build a better common understanding, to act together towards a more open, free, secure, and stable global online environment. I won't take much more of your time, and because I want to give the floor to the authors of the report. So back to you, Giacomo, and thank you for having me this morning.
Thank you, Nathalie, for your kind words, and also for being always a great supporter of our work. It means a lot to us. So, for those of you who haven't had the chance to look at the taxonomy and the narrative that goes with it, you'll see on the slide the QR code. You can download it on your phone. Particularly for those of you that are following us online, it might be easier to do so. But we'll keep it in the room also for a few seconds to give the chance to attendees here in New York to do it. I wanted to say that the plan, it is in fact to print it on an A2, but unfortunately the New York UN print shop does not print on A2, so we were forced to do it in the small way. But there are plans to in fact do it in a foldable way that can be easy read. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please. So just as a means of introduction, we heard even yesterday how the threat landscape is rapidly evolving and how ICTs are, of course, a key threat to international peace and security. We heard yesterday during the first session of the UEWG how important it is to get that first section on threats, get it right. And to do so, it is, we believe that it is important to increase a common understanding of malicious ICT incidents and all of the different components that make them. You'll see them depicted in our taxonomy, with the Malicious ICT Act in itself being at the center. But then, of course, if you go beyond the act itself and you consider the incident as a whole, then there are multiple other inputs and outputs that characterize it. So really, this is the purpose of our taxonomy, to try to help building this common understanding of existing threats. And as I mentioned earlier, we hope that this will be impactful not only to support negotiations, but also to facilitate information exchange, whether it's bilateral, regional, or at the multilateral level on threats, but also at the national level to support threat assessments, again, for those countries that are still in the process of developing their own national capabilities. Next slide, please. Just a couple of words on the methodology before I give the floor to Samuele that will go over the taxonomy itself. We did quite an extensive desk review of all of the existing taxonomies that are out there, and there are a lot. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but we really wanted to create a tool that was tailored for our primary audience, which is yourself, which is policymakers or other stakeholders that are involved in policy discussions. So we had the challenge of striking the right balance between being technically accurate, but at the same time clear and understandable enough to make sure that we didn't go down some of the rabbit holes of the more technical stuff that is very important for another audience, but perhaps not to support policy discussions. We created a first draft of the taxonomy that was circulated, validated by a number of experts coming from both the policy and the technical community, and based on the feedback, we revised it and we produced what you see in front of you today. So this is just to demonstrate that, like anything that UNIDIR does, there is always like a rigorous research methodology behind it. And with that note, I will happily give the floor to my colleague Samuele that will provide a first kind of overview of the taxonomy and its components. I should have said at the beginning, apologies, after 2 years of virtual events, probably I should have said it earlier, but if this is a participatory event, please do take the floor for comments and questions. If you're in the room, just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and fire away your question. If you're following us online, Please, this is because of the high number of attendees, we structured this as a WebEx event, which means that if you want to take the floor, we need to make you a panelist. So please do raise your virtual hand or send us a message in the chat if you want to take the floor, and allow our technical support a few moments to give you the right to be able to unmute yourself and speak. With that, Samuele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Can you hear me? I can see you. I guess
Yeah,
you can
yes,
hear me.
we can hear you, Samuele.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So, as you can see, the taxonomy that we ideated is composed really of a simple diagram with three different kinds of colored cells. Light blue cells represent the element or inputs necessary for a malicious ICT incident to take place. And these are the perpetrator, the vector, the victim, the targeted asset, and the cybersecurity failures. The black cell at the center of the radial diagram is the malicious ICT act, which we define as the intentional act that leverages ICTs to compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information or data. The blue cell on the right side of the taxonomy represent the possible outputs resulting from a malicious ICT act, and each cell should be conceived as open in terms of item listed. Indeed, new topologies or more detailed items can be added in case there is a need for a more granular understanding of a malicious ICT incident. But at this point, let me make a distinction between the terms incident and act. As you can see, we are using them in two different ways. The first refers to the broad understanding of a malicious ICT act. To a broader understanding of a malicious ICT event, which encompasses all the elements we identified in the taxonomy. Whereas the second one refers more to the intrusion phase of a system or of a network. It should also be added that an incident may be comprised of one single malicious act or may be made of multiple attempts with the intent to achieve a primary effect on a victim. Let me provide with an overview of the different cells by starting from the top left one. And here we have the perpetrator, which we broadly categorized in two ways. Could be a state actor or a non-state actor. And both categories include a more detailed subcategories. For state actors, we have the Euro state organs, de facto state organs, and last but not least, entities controlled or directed by a state. For non-state actors, we are referring to individuals or groups that are natural persons that are conducting malicious activities alone or in group, and organization, and this time should be recognized by a state, meaning private companies, association, or non-governmental organizations. Moving down to the next cell, we have the vector. And for the vector, we intended the mean by which the perpetrator is able to gain access to information resource system. And if you are familiar with the MITRE attack model, this could relate to the initial access phase. For this cell, the taxonomy relies on the categorization carried out by two scholars, Applegate and Stavro, which is very broad and includes technology. And in this case, the perpetrator exploits or manipulates technology. And of course, the most common thing is to exploit a vulnerability, an ICT vulnerability. Then we also have a processes, and this is gained by manipulating flowed processes, which could be organizational, for example, security policies, or production in case of a supply chain. And as an example of this process could be misconfiguration, in the sense that if settings are not properly configured, For example, just by keeping default setting in your IT device, such as a modem, these can become a vector for a malicious act. But then also people can become the vector when they reveal private information to a perpetrator to access system or networks, and this can be done, for example, through social engineering. The perpetrator may use several vectors in order to have to achieve a full-blown malicious ICT act. For example, you may need to have multiple vulnerabilities in order to successfully penetrate a system. Moreover, as Applegate and Stavro framed in the research, each of these subcategories could be further subdivided into more specific and discrete vectors. But here we stop and we leave it to the reader to use further categorization that they may be familiar with. Subsequently, we have the victim. And here we're making a twofold categorization. First, we differentiate between intended, unintended, and collateral victims. And then we look at what are the nature of the victim. Intended victim, as you may know, could be as you may understand, are the intended victim of a malicious ICT act, the one with suffer from the primary effects of a malicious ICT act. Then we have instrumental victim that can be the subject exploited by the perpetrator to achieve an effect on an intended victim. And as an example, we gave the person whose device is part of a botnet that then conduct a malicious ICT act on an intended victim. And then, of course, the collateral victims that are all the subjects that are unintentionally hit by a malicious ICT act, for example, the uncontrolled propagation of a malware. In terms of subject, there are multiples. We identified individuals such as citizens, political leaders, celebrities, organizations, university, political parties, companies. Critical infrastructures / properties include energy, health. We had just had the Cyber Stability Conference acts on these subjects. Then we also have countries when the victim is the economy of a country, the security, or the society as a whole, or the political system. And then we also have the international system as a victim in case the act hit international organization, regional entities, or in this case, common goods like the environment. We move now to targeted asset cell, and these are the assets that can be targeted by a malicious act. And for this cell, we relied on the classification of targets conceptualized by Simmons and others in their famous taxonomy called Avoided It. And here they listed several assets, operating system. As you know, this is responsible for the coordination, for the coordinating activities of a computer. Network that can goes from a local area network to a metropolitan area network. Local devices, often we refer to personal computer or smartphone. Users, and in this case, the perpetrator targets the users to retrieve personal information. And application can be, it's a software or a program, can be either a client, so it's installed on a local device, or can be a server application, in this case is running on a remote device. Last but not least, another relevant element for a successful conduction of malicious ICT act concerns the possible cybersecurity failures. And for this taxonomy, we look at both IT and human-driven failures. Speaking of ICT failures, we further split them in ICT defense, monitoring, and product vulnerabilities. The ICT defense refers to measure deployed to protect the system, whereas or a network, whereas monitoring refers to measure aimed at scrutinizing the network. And for example, by using a metaphor, ICT defense can be considered like the walls that protect a fortress, and monitoring is the activity that guards are doing in observing the surrounding. In the text, of course, you will find more details about these two elements. In terms of product failures, we are referring to flaws and vulnerabilities in ICT products. And these vulnerabilities can be there because of multiple reasons. They've not been discovered yet. In this case, if they are discovered not by the vendor or the by producer, they're called 0 days. They may not be patched yet or installed yet. In this case, it's user responsibility to download and install the updates, which include the patch. For human-driven failures, whereas we split them into organizational failures, such as, for example, an organization, a company that does not have a security strategy in place, for example, requiring a strong password or backup practices. And the human dimension, which refers to individual digital behavior. And this is key if we consider that, according to some experts, 90% of a malicious ICT incident still begins with a phishing email. Let's now move to the center of the diagram. And here is the black cell concerning the Malicious ICT Act. As we said, is an intentional act that leverages ICTs to compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information or data, producing disruptive effects on a victim. We are not covering non-intentional and non-adversarial incidents, such as those that can be the result of an environmental disaster. The act itself can contain more phases that must be successfully executed in succession to achieve the desired results. And these phases can be further unpacked in a more granular intrusion analysis. For example, by looking at the different steps of the so-called cyber kill chain, or through more detailed understanding of the techniques, and procedures, such as by looking at the MITRE attack model. But given the intended purpose of this taxonomy, we are not covering these more detailed intrusions analysis. Yet, this taxonomy should be complementary to intrusion models that we just mentioned. In terms of output cells, we have the 4 in darker blue color on the right side of the screen. And we begin from top to bottom with the gains or the reasons that underpin the perpetrator's choice to conduct a malicious act. And this can be categorized into 3 main gains: economic, political, governmental, and personal. And these are really broad categories, which may include business or criminal gain, but also military gain. We move then to the effects of Malicious ICT Act. We acknowledge, and this is something that we want to stress, that there are 2 main types of primary effect resulting from ICT Act: disruptive and exploitative. The first one concerns the effect listed in the cell, like the one that you can see on the screen, whereas the latter result more from acts aimed at illicitly acquiring information through the exploitation of different sources. However, because these activities, the exploitation, so the illicit acquiring of information, may fall within activities that are not inconsistent with the state obligation under the responsible state behavior framework, in this research, we did not include them in the taxonomy. In terms of disruptive effects, we followed Harry and Gallagher categorization, and we have message manipulation, which refer to any act that interferes with the victim's ability to present or communicate its message to users or customers base. And these include website defacement, for example, hijacking of social media accounts. We have disruption of services, which refers to effects that degrade or deny the victim's ability to access information system, device, or other network resources. And last but second to last, data attacks, which refers to acts that produce effects on data, such as data manipulation, destruction, or encryption. And in this subcategory, we have, for example, the so-called wipers or ransomware. And finally, destruction, which refer to the disruption of physical system through ICT manipulation. So these are the primary effects of an incident on a targeted asset of the victim. Of course, effects may also entail harm. And to understand harm, we look at the studies conducted by Agrafiotis and others on cyber harm. They define cyber harms as the damage directly caused by malicious act, conducted wholly or partially via digital infrastructures and the information, devices, and software applications that these infrastructures are composed of. In the cell, you can find the different typologies of harm listed. Last but not least, there is attribution. Of course, not all incidents are attributed, and in fact, it's a pretty difficult and cumbersome process. Here we listed the three distinct and sometimes intertwined typologies: technical, legal, and political. Technical implies the analysis of the technical aspects of malicious ICT incidents, which can include malware signatures, tactics, techniques, and procedures, traffic analysis. And technical analysis is all frequently augmented by the analysis of the socio-political factors of the malicious ICT incident. Then we have legal, which can refer either to the responsibility of a state for the conduct of a malicious ICT activity, but not all the acts envisage legal consideration, as they may not amount to a breach of international obligation of states. You need to have a case of international law to conduct a legal attribution. But also, they refer to the responsibility of an individual for the conduct of a malicious ICT act in accordance with the domestic legislation and relevant standards of proof. Political is the last one, and concerns the choice of the victim state or another state to attribute an act to a perpetrator. The political attribution can be private or public, and this is a political choice because there are no obligation or expectation for a state to attribute a malicious ICT incident. However, there is a growing trend in which states resort to criminal law consideration to politically attribute a malicious ICT incident. And so with this, I think we covered the main points of the taxonomy, and I thank you, and I give back the floor to Giacomo.
Thank you. Thank you, Samuele, for going over the taxonomy, or at least the graphic part of it. As you mentioned, in the text that goes with it, there are much more detailed information about pretty much every single element that is part of the taxonomy. I think it is important to note how a few things that Samuele highlighted in his remarks. One is that this is a living document. New taxonomies are being produced pretty much on a monthly basis as the threat landscape evolves. So does the scholar effort to try to capture it, whether it is from academia or from the technical community. This is a very vibrant effort, and it's constantly moving. So this is meant to be something that is going to have to be updated at some point, but hopefully it serves as it sits at a high enough level that its shelf life is going to be more than 6 months, as we all hope. In addition, I think it is important to note that in the context of a malicious ICT act, it is most likely than not that all of the different options under each of the bubbles, if you want, are not going to be mutually exclusive. It's most likely that cyber incidents will be characterized by a variety of vectors targeting a variety of failures and assets to achieve a variety of effects. And it's also important to note that in the aftermath of an event, this information might not be available all at once. So the purpose of this taxonomy is also to provide a framework, if you want, that victims or those that are interested in analyzing cyber incidents can populate as information becomes available. And sometimes it takes hours, sometimes it takes months, sometimes you may never get all of the information that you need. So it is really important to see this as a living document in both ways. One, in the sense that we recognize that at some point it will need to be updated, but also a living document in the sense that the information that users may include or pull out, depending which perspective you're following from this taxonomy, will be changing over time as more information becomes available. We try to use it as an internal test to take a few of the very popular and well covered in the public domain cyber incidents that have happened, whether they were adversarial or not. We just tried it to see if it would survive or if it would be a useful tool to kind of map out the different characteristics of these incidents, and it did work. So hopefully it sits at a, as I said, sufficiently high level that it can be useful for a while. There are a few questions in the Q&A chat. So I'll start, Samuele, with one for you. I hope you do have the taxonomy open in front of you, because there is a very specific question from a colleague at the Stimson Center. Could you explain footnote 15? And since I don't have the full printout in front of me, I do hope that you do, and you can. If not, please pull it out. I'll try to buy you a few more seconds. In the meantime, there is a very high-level question that probably goes beyond the purpose of this taxonomy. That says, after a short introduction, says, how can we tackle state-induced malicious activities? I think that is a very important and good question, and I guess it's really not through this taxonomy, but probably through the discussions that are ongoing in the context of the OEWG. Just for the sake of transparency, for those of you in the room that cannot see the Q&A, the full question reads: some government uses software to extract data from important dignitaries and from citizens, but they don't accept their malicious activities. How can we tackle state-induced malicious activities? So that was the full question. Samuele, do you have did you have the time to look at footnote 15?
Yes, it's the footnote where we made the disclaimer that with this taxonomy we're not covering exploitative ICT incidents, and those refers to the illicit acquisition of information. And at the beginning we covered them, but then given the fact labeling this act like as malicious and so illegal, and so if you're setting this taxonomy in the framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, acquiring information from other states or other stakeholders is not considered illegal, and therefore we couldn't include these type of acts inside this kind of taxonomy. After all, espionage is not illegal international affairs. I hope that this clarifies the footnote.
Thank you. And I may add that one of the first challenge that we faced when designing this project or conceptualizing this project was scoping and decide what's in scope, what's not in scope. There is the espionage element. Is it included? Is it not included? The cybercrime element. Is it included? Is it not included? So it is the scoping of this sort of taxonomies. It's always a challenge, and no matter where you draw the line, you will make some people happy and some people not happy. So this is just the approach we decided to take. Doesn't necessarily mean that is the only right approach. We just needed to draw a boundary around our effort. There are before I carry on with the questions, there are quite a few in the Q&A chat. I just wanted to see if in the room I see three hands, and then I'm going to go back to the Q&A on the chat. Please, I don't know who was first.
I don't know if for the folks online. Great. Yes, great. Hi, I'm Louise Marie Rell. I'm with the Europe Institute, a think tank based in Brazil, but kind of wearing my academic hats over here for a second. So I was curious about the first distinction between an incident, a malicious ICT incident, and an event. I asked that because, of course, when thinking about be it attribution, be it the unpacking of what an incident is, right? There's this temporality. So I was just wondering, which, for example, the cyber kill chain kind of provides, how things work in a particular set of time. So I was just wondering, in the conversations, in the methodology, the focus groups, it would be interesting to hear how and if you discussed how this framework, how the taxonomy could help or work together with other frameworks to include this temporality element, right? Because for an incident to be considered a malicious ICT incident, there's a whole process. So if the framework, if the taxonomy could be applied ex post, right? So when it's already consolidated that it is a malicious ICT incident, or whether it could be applied before that. So I was just wondering, in the focus groups, did you have that conversation? And if so, it would just be interesting, because I think the most contentious element is getting to the point of defining if it is or not a malicious ICT incident. And again, as an academic kind of hat person, perhaps it would be super interesting in future iterations to have this case study alongside the taxonomy, just to illustrate what you just said, because you said, UNIDIR did that in the focus groups, just to illustrate the application and operationalization of that, alongside also other frameworks such as MITRE, because at least for me as a person that's studying specifically incident response and ICT incidents, it's interesting to see how this framework could bridge the divide between, let's say, the processes happening at the technical level and the diplomats kind of trying to unpack and understand and get into the conversation. So just a comment overall and feedback and potential next steps, of course, and this broader question of, whether how to incorporate the temporality of defining what an malicious ICT incident is in the application of the framework, ex ante or ex post.
Thank you. I'll just take the other questions and then come back to you on that. Also, Samuele, please take some time to reflect on that.
First, I would second that. I think, one of the things that many of us have seen is that the incident changes over time as you get more information, as you said yourself. So, I think just a recognition that there's that temporal element is important. But the other thing that I thought would be interesting is having a factor about level of confidence, because that also changes over time. So in other words, does whoever it is who's making this judgment using this taxonomy, what is their level of confidence in this, which will change over time as they get more information. And that might be just useful for when they're communicating it to someone else, saying this is a level of confidence. There are two areas, not to suggest more work for you, but there are two areas, and this is very helpful, so thank you for this. One is like maybe a year out as people are using this to then to assess it and see how it's being used, I think would be useful. And the other is a number of countries, including the U.S. a few years ago, started coming out with severity indexes, what level an incident was, using either color codes or numbers or whatever they want to use. I think it'd be interesting for UNIDIR to gather those or do a comparative look at those. And I think it links to this very nicely, too. I don't think we're going to ever come up with a uniform, everyone agrees to the same severity code, but I think it's useful in the area of communication for one, either country or participant to understand what another country or participant means when they say it's a certain level. And I think UNIDIR can play a role in doing a little bit of that, either translation or at least making people aware of that. So not to put more work on your plate, but to put more work on your plate.
And we love good suggestions for interesting work. So please, thank you. Last comment from the room, and then we'll go back to you, Samuele.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gaurav from Singapore. So I have the unique privilege and displeasure also of being both kind of a policy entity looking at international impact and the considerations of cybersecurity incident, but I'm also an operational entity. So I'm a technical person, and so many a times when I face an incident, I'm the guy who ends up writing the report about what happened. So I have two broad comments. The first is I love it. I'm going to use it. Many of the things that you put here in these big bubbles, we use similar terms, but now that there's a structure and a clear standardization, it just makes it simpler for us to write the report. And if anybody asks us why we're using the term effect, I'll blame the UN instead of blaming my staff. So it's very useful. But the second comment is I intend to abuse it and misuse it on two levels. The first is that I know you have that carefully crafted footnote 15 that espionage actually is out of the scope here. But actually, there's nothing stopping us from using it for data theft as well. The concepts, the words all still apply. Because you've defined malicious ICT acts as specifically compromising confidentiality, actually, we can use it, even though I don't think the report was designed for it. The other way in which I'm going to misuse and abuse it is to extend it. So you talked about cybersecurity failures. A lot of the times when our technical teams go in to understand, there are latent failures, there are active failures, so failures that were inherent in the system, like the zero-day vulnerabilities. There are active failures. The thing gave you an alert and you chose to shut it down. There are other frameworks that link to each of these bubbles that we will then kind of try our best to merge and overlap. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a very good example. But that, to us, only handles one specific part. How did they get in and what did they do? It doesn't talk about, what were they trying to do in terms of political objectives, in terms of economic objectives, etc. So I think it's a very useful starting point. I would ask, given that you have put in so much research to look at all of the other frameworks, if you could help us understand which of the other frameworks you looked at and how they could connect to which of these bubbles. So there are frameworks around severity that link directly to effect and to harm. They don't have anything to do with the perpetrator or the vector. There are frameworks on, like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, that look primarily at the vector and the failure. They don't have anything to do with the effect or the harm or the attribution, etc. So because you've done the research, you've mapped all of those out, if you can let us know, then depending on which framework we independently choose as a nation or as an organization to use, at least we understand how it fits into this whole map. And you've got that picture in your head at least. It's then useful for us to be on a common page as we extend this framework. And I think this will be an extendable framework that you have the big bubbles here, but eventually I can imagine this looking like a mind map over the years where we'll extrapolate what effects could be and have sub-bubbles under the effects. But I thought it was a very useful piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the positive feedback, and please feel free to use it or abuse it as you see fit. If it is useful, we're happy. And I think just before I give the floor to Samuele and then go back, I see colleagues from Russia with their hand raised, so I'm going to give them the floor as well. But it is the temporal question is interesting because I think that, and Samuele, you were the one that engaged with the experts and the creators of various frameworks, so please chip in here. But I think the purpose of this framework is really not to substitute or to try to kind of find, squeeze in, if you want, in between frameworks that already exist. To me, this taxonomy sits above. It's a layer above that gives you the broader understanding of all of the different elements and components, and then you can zoom in into different bubbles, if you want. And for each of those, you may find the more specific framework that allow you to map over the course of time, how did the incident develop, etc. But you kind of made an interesting point on the fact that the way it is depicted, it kind of assumes that it has already been determined that a malicious ICT act took place. And that's a very interesting comment. My answer to that, but please, Samuele, correct me if you have a different view, is that this gives you the kind of the comprehensive view. As we know and as we discussed, information may become available, in time. So you can decide to, use this ex post and say, okay, this took place. Let's try to use this framework to create a report, to create a broader understanding of what happened and why. or you can use it as information becomes available. So as information on the left and on the right of that framework become available to you, you can use to inform your ultimate determination on whether or not you are indeed facing a malicious ICT act. But Samuele, do you have something to add on your side?
No, I totally agree with this, with what you said. It could be used both ex ante or ex post. I mean, probably in our idea was more to inform policymakers. So in the sense that it's something that probably could be by, I don't know, the technical community, the computer emergency response team, then to report to the policy level, and so giving them a grid to understand what happened. But at the same time, as you said, it could also be used like a compass to understand step by step while the information are getting through regarding cyber events, cyber incidents, about what other information we are missing, or what misinformation we need more to define whether we are confronted with a cyber incident. Good idea regarding the severity indexes. We may consider as a next step, or to expand the scope of the taxonomy. And yes, again, please feel free to misuse the taxonomy. The only point I would like to make is that for what concern the effects, so if you want to use it for what concern gathering information, for what concern the effects, we used the taxonomy by Perry and Gallagher, and they do have another categorization for what concern the effects of data exploitation. And so you may want to look at them instead of looking at data attack or denial of services, because these may not really pertain to an act aimed to exploit information. And yes, of course, for what concern references to other existing works, we did put them in the footnotes. So every time we refer to a previous work, taxonomy, classification, we put it in the footnotes, and we also quote in text that we were using the categorization by, I don't know, we used avoided it by Simmons and others. We used Agraphiotis for what concern the bubble or the cell of the cyber harms. So once you download the document, you will see in the footnotes all the different references that we used. Thanks.
Thank you, Samuele. I see the technical support was very kind and gave the opportunity to colleagues from Moscow to make their intervention by voice. So please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for the presentation of the research concerning a taxonomy in malicious ICT incidents. After examining the publication of this topic and the components of the radial diagram regarding ICT incidents, I would like to raise some issues and present comments and on behalf of the National Computer Incident Response and Coordination Center. At this stage, the proposed taxonomy of malicious ICT incidents is a political document that does not contribute to enhancing interstate cooperation, transparency, and predictability in cyberspace. From our point of view, this document does not fully reflect the landscape of current risks and may lead to risks of misperceptions, escalation, and conflict that may result from the use of ICTs. In particular, a special emphasis is placed on state-sponsored malicious activity. However, this taxonomy does not include information about terrorist organizations whose purpose is to intimidate the population, recruit citizens, spread radical ideology, and etc. For example, there is no indication of it within the Against section. Besides, the goals of organized criminal groups are not fully revealed. In addition, the research does not make any reference to the absence of evidence when attributing cyber attacks. The document does not include a characteristic of cyberspace like anonymity, which creates prerequisites for illegal actions under a false flag, which is used by criminals, including terrorists. As a result, special services and law enforcement agency cannot effectively and timely identify the source of dissemination of fake information or cyber attack and effectively respond to cyber crimes. The problem is exacerbated by the development and sophistication of ICTs. In this regard, the section on cyber attack attribution leads to serious doubts. For instance, a new trend of this year is the increasing availability of cyber attacks tools. There is uncontrolled and unpunished distribution of cyber attack tools, as well as instruction of arranging cyber attacks and developing practical malicious cyber skills that take place in national cyberspace of some states. In addition, the model of providing malicious tools as a service has actually been formed. The so-called malware as a service and attack as a service. Hence, the question is, how can one prove the social political gains of an actor during interstate escalation, especially if a third actor that formally is not a party to this conflict benefits from it? To our mind, political attribution does not meet the main objectives of the UN Charter, in particular the maintenance of peace and international security. Considering a lack of reliable attribution techniques in cyberspace, a close cooperation between the relevant state organizations should be established. There are the purposes that should be pursued by the international community while establishing the UN POC's directory that was discussed yesterday. To sum up, we draw your attention to the fact that the proposed taxonomy will not contribute to a shared characterization of the threat environment and the adequate assessment of cyber incident. Instead, it will be used as a political tool to make unsubstantiated accusation against undesirable states. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your intervention. That was noted. A couple of responses from my side. First, we did include non-state as a category of potential perpetrators, including both individuals but also organizations, and so we do feel that we wanted by design not to limit this taxonomy to only one specific actor. The purpose of this taxonomy and is really not to do an analysis of the threat landscape, which would have absolutely be lacking the elements that you mentioned around. We didn't go into analyzing what is the threat landscape like in terms of what are the challenges, like anonymity, what are the challenges of obtaining data that can substantiate or support attribution processes. It's none of that was part of the purpose of this taxonomy. This taxonomy was simply a tool to help states and other stakeholders put the right concepts in the right places without trying necessarily to make any trying to pursue any other objective related, for example, to identifying one perpetrator as being more important than another, or one type of attribution to be more important than another. The only thing we've mapped in this taxonomy are all of the different elements that we believe can constitute cyber incidents without making a value judgment of which ones are more important than others. As such, we do hope that it will be used for what it is and not being instrumentalized for political purposes. We don't think that there is that the content of this taxonomy really lends itself to instrumentalization at the political level, although we heard in the room that it can be used for internally for purposes that were beyond its initial scope. But anyway, thank you for your observation. I see one more question from the room.
Am I read? Okay, thanks very much. I'm Robert Young from the Legal Bureau at the Foreign Ministry of Canada, Global Affairs Canada. First of all, I want to say congratulations to UNIDIR on this publication on taxonomy. Kudos to you. It seems like to us, like a very useful exercise, both in the process that you've described, and I know my colleague David Fairburn from Geneva was part of the consultation process as an example of what you've just described of engaging stakeholders. And I think as a result of that, you have a product that is going to be useful for many states. So thank you very much for that. There are a couple of points I particularly liked I wanted to highlight. The first is I was delighted that at the center of this, you've used the term Malicious ICT Act. As an international lawyer, I cringe every time the word attack is used in this space because of its important meanings in international law. But I understand that technical people and journalists and sometimes political leaders like to use the term attack without quite understanding they might be adding to confusion. So I really love that you've chosen that term. I'm still trying to think of a sort of fun and sexy acronym for malicious ICT attack, but maybe it'll work in English or French or Dutch or something, I'm not sure. But one day we'll come up with a term that we'll all, but it's so much better than attack. The second is I really appreciated that under the attribution section, you've broken it down into those three kinds of attribution and unpacked it as technical, legal, and political. This is certainly the way Canada looks at it, and I know many states do. And I also liked in your comments that you noted that political attribution, and I think this is worth recalling, can be private or can be public. It can be part of diplomacy, bilateral discussions between states, and I think that's very useful. We understand attribution to be a sovereign responsibility and a sovereign right, and we think it's up to each state to attribute if and when it sees fit, and for each state to determine how much evidence or information is required before it makes an attribution publicly or privately. And, you know, states can make their case and then they will determine, and I believe state practice over time will determine what will become persuasive and what will be practically useful in encouraging other states to modify their behavior. So we see it as a dynamic process of states exercising sovereign rights. We also think attribution is a key part of responsible state behavior. It's part of the reason why Canada has published, and if people want to see it, we're happy to share it with you. We've published our attribution framework so that others will know the steps that we go through before, which you've encapsulated here, in this bullet in the bottom right, but that we take this matter seriously and thoughtfully and carefully, I would say. I had only one little little level of discomfort, very small. Over in the right under effect, I want to say, first of all, that I really like how you've broken down effect and harm. I think that's very useful. Canada recently published our international law statement, our national statement, and we struggled a little bit in our discussions. My colleague, Lieutenant Commander McCarthy, was part of that process. We struggled a little bit, but you break it out very clearly here, and I'm sure that will be useful for many states and other stakeholders. I did question a little bit the term data attack in there, both because of my allergy to the term attack, but also because it seems to me in talking about effects, the attack is not the effect, it's the what happens to the data, it seems to be. So if there is another iteration, maybe that can be tweaked a little bit. But overall, I just wanted to say thank you for this, and I look forward to reading not just the small version, not just the footnotes, but the entire document. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm afraid we're running out of time, and I know you all have to go to the main room, and you have a busy day in front of you. So I just would like to finish this event by, first of all, giving Nathalie, I don't know if you want to have a final word on, if you want to say something. If not, I'll just wrap it up, please. Okay. So you will all be receiving a link to our feedback form. Please do take a moment to fill it in. Thank you so much for participating. The event will be published on our social media channels. So if you want to share it with your colleagues, please do. And thank you so much for coming, and I wish you a great continuation of the day.
Thank you very much.